And he said, God really did change my life. And he said, I never wanted anything to do with politics. I always wanted to, just to be the fella, even if as governor now, which he said surprises me that I made this decision, but I'm glad I did. But he said, I want to be remembered as the man who walked in Walmart to buy fishing lures and used to be the governor. My dad was president. That's the only way I want people to think about me. But he said, I honestly believe that I am supposed to run for president. He said, I believe it's something God wants me to do. And he said, I can't explain it, but I believe my country is going to need me at this time.
On September 11th, 2001, that premonition came true. The nation and the world changed, perhaps forever. The events of 9/11 sent shockwaves around the globe. As we watched the horror unfold at the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., President Bush walked away from the innocence of a gathering of school children in Florida to face the hatred and uncertainty of a group of madmen bent on destroying this nation. How would his sense of destiny serve him and the nation? How would he stand up to the monstrous evil that now faced America? Would we see him rise up in righteous wrath or sink to his knees in prayer? Or would this young neophyte president do both?
In all my years of studying the American presidency, I have never heard of a president having such a sense spiritually of what was going to happen while he was in office. I think this explains George W. Bush's sense of destiny. I think it explains his leadership style, and it also reveals why we saw such strength in him following September the 11th.
But once again, the president's willingness to admit that he seeks counsel from God ignited a critical firestorm unparalleled in American history.
Bush's, quote, national security strategy, unquote, amounts to an enormously presumptuous agenda for domination of the entire world.
I think that
for a brief moment, when the mind-numbing horror of 9/11 was still settling in, America, once again, seemed to come together. America's churches were filled, and the nation looked to its leadership with hope and determination. Unhappily, the unity of purpose soon gave way to political expediency. Some high-ranking government officials actually suggested that Bush invented the tragedy of 9/11 for political purposes. Misguided critics have gone so far as to suggest that since the terrorists are driven by religious zeal, Bush's claim to religious beliefs makes him no different than the enemy. This reasoning suggests that somehow the specter of a Muslim terrorist strapping a bomb to his 14-year-old son is the moral equivalent of President Bush gathering a 14-year-old girl into his arms and hugging her to his chest, a girl whose mother was killed in the World Trade Center bombing. The nation, indeed the world, was catapulted into war on that September morning. Since then, the question has been, does the expressed and apparently deeply held faith of the man who occupies the White House bring us closer together as a nation, or does it drive us apart? September 14th, 2001. Shortly thereafter, the most brutal dictator in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein, a man who defied the mandates of the United Nations and had openly supported terrorism, was also toppled. But for George W. Bush, it wasn't just a matter of defeating an enemy. It was an opportunity to bring hope and freedom and democracy to a part of the world where such things were unknown. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld has been quoted as explaining it this way. After our nation was attacked on 9/11, we fought back in Afghanistan, but we also made clear that America was not interested in conquest or colonization. And today, we are helping the Afghan people rebuild from the rubble of war and establish institutions of democracy. That is the American way. And even though it's largely ignored in the mainstream press, today in Iraq, the U.S. has rebuilt over 1,500 schools. All 240 hospitals and 1,200 clinics are open. Over 22 million Iraqi children have received vaccinations. Nearly all of Iraq's 400 courts are functioning. Power generation now exceeds the pre-war average, and the wheels of commerce are turning in all major cities and towns. And even as the argument over Hussein's weapons of mass destruction raged on, Muammar Gaddafi, the leader, dictator of Libya, suddenly abandoned his atomic weapons program. Things are changing in the Middle East, and changing for the better.
President Bush will be known as the man that stood up to Islamic fundamentalism being used to tyrannize their own people. So in another 100 years, in the Islamic world, he'll be viewed as a great liberator and the one who began the process to set them free from those who use Islam to enslave Islamic people politically.
Even as President Bush seems to be staying the course on the battle against terrorism, he recently addressed the United Nations with the moral clarity of an Old Testament biblical prophet in challenging the nations of the world to eliminate modern-day slavery.
Each year, an estimated 800,000 to 900,000